In the middle years of the 14th century, Europe breathed beneath the weight of ordinary days. The ringing of church bells measured time, and the rhythm of life was bound to the turning of the seasons. Farmers bent their backs in the fields, bakers kneaded dough at dawn, and merchants bustled in crowded squares filled with the scent of spices, smoke, and sweat. For all the hardships of the medieval world, war, hunger, and the long cold of winter, there was a sense of continuity, of lives unfolding as they always had. Few could have imagined that an invisible shadow was already drifting toward them, borne along rivers, roads, and winds, a shadow that would alter everything. The story of the Black Death is at once historical and legendary, rooted in fact but cloaked in myth. To understand it, one must move slowly, as if walking by candlelight through a ruined hall, each step revealing more fragments of truth and imagination. The plague was not just an illness. It was an event so vast, so incomprehensible, that it reshaped memory, art, faith, and folklore for centuries. In quiet villages, in walled cities, even in the halls of kings, it brought a silence deeper than any war could cause. Yet alongside the silence came stories, whispered explanations, and dark legends that gave shape to the fear. We begin at the edge of Europe, before the pestilence had settled fully into its soil. Far to the east, trade routes wound across deserts and mountains, carrying silk, porcelain, and spices, but also carrying something unseen. The people who lived at the far end of these roads were no strangers to sickness. Yet this particular illness, hidden in the bodies of fleas and carried by rats, had begun its journey westward with a persistence that no caravan guard, no ship captain, and no prayer could stop. By the time it reached the Mediterranean, it was already too late to contain. Imagine the ports of Genoa or Venice, their harbors crowded with ships, sails flapping gently in the sea breeze. These were cities alive with chatter, music, and trade, where exotic goods and distant stories arrived daily. When the plague first touched them, it did not announce itself in thunder or flame, but quietly, through the fever of a sailor, the swelling of a merchant's lymph nodes, the sudden death of a child. At first, such death could be mistaken for ordinary illness. But the pace quickened. Whole households collapsed within days. Fear spread faster than certainty. And with fear came questions. Why was this happening? Was it punishment from God, the anger of the heavens at a sinful world? Was it a curse, unleashed by foreign enemies? Or perhaps, as legends began to suggest, it was a work of malevolent spirits drifting invisibly through the night air. People stared at the same events, but explained them in different ways. Doctors spoke of corrupted air, priests thundered of divine justice, and storytellers whispered of figures in black cloaks walking unseen through the alleys, touching doors with invisible hands. This is where the history of the Black Death becomes inseparable from its legends. To live through such terror was to inhabit a space between known and unknown, between light and shadow. Facts were scarce, and imagination filled the void. When a village lost half its people within a month, when parents buried their children only to foil themselves, when entire parishes lay silent, stories became a way to endure. Some tales offered comfort, others spread dread, but all of them lingered long after the plague itself receded. As we wander through this history, it is important to notice the contrasts. There are records written by monks and chroniclers, carefully noting dates, numbers, and symptoms. Yet beside them are painted murals of skeletal dancers, peasants whispering of ghostly processions, and songs sung about the plague as if it were a living creature. There is the solid ground of what happened, and there is the misty terrain of how it was remembered. Together they form the landscape we must cross. The calm rhythm of daily medieval life makes the intrusion of the Black Death all the more striking. One moment, a town celebrated a wedding with feasting, music, and dancing. A week later, the same town could be echoing only with a toll of funeral bells. The suddenness created a sense of unreality. Survivors later described it as if death had flown through the air like a cold wind, leaving bodies collapsed in the streets where laughter had recently filled the air. Even now, centuries later, these descriptions carry the weight of a nightmare remembered too clearly. In this introduction, we prepare ourselves to journey not only through history but also through the legends that still cling to it. We will see how stories of demons, witches, and omens grew from the soil of fear. We will meet the wandering flagellants who believed blood could purify the world, the plague doctors whose strange masks became symbols of both healing and horror, and the artists who painted death itself into margins of manuscripts and onto the walls of chapels. We will walk with the survivors, who explain their unlikely survival through charms, remedies, or simple faith. And we will sit with a silence left behind in villages where no one returned. This is not merely a tale of disease. It is a tale of how human beings, confronted with something they could not see and could not control, turned to the only tools they had: faith, imagination, and story. The Black Death is remembered not just in the numbers who perished, but in the myths that gave the plague a face, a voice, even a personality. These myths were not distractions from reality. They were the means by which people lived within it. As the candlelight flickers on these first pages of history, let us pause and take a breath. We are about to step deeper into a world where the line between fact and legend is blurred, where silence is filled with whispers, and where history itself feels like a shadowed chamber echoing with voices long gone. The journey ahead will move slowly, carefully, as if walking through a haunted landscape. The fields of medieval Europe are emptying before us, and in the stillness, we begin to sense that something vast, dark, and enduring has already arrived. The Black Death did not appear in Europe as if summoned out of thin air. Its path was long, winding, and mercilessly patient. To trace its origins is to follow a shadow moving steadily across continents, carried not by soldiers or kings, but by tiny, overlooked creatures, fleas hidden in the fur of rats, clinging to sacks of grain, stowed away in barrels of cloth, and resting unseen in the darkness of ships' holds. The plague was an invisible traveler, quiet at first, and then suddenly overwhelming, and it made its journey across the ancient arteries of trade that had connected East and West for centuries. Far beyond the familiar borders of medieval Europe, across the steppes of Central Asia, whispers of the pestilence had already begun. Chroniclers in distant lands spoke of villages emptied overnight, of sudden, inexplicable deaths that no physician could cure. The trade routes known as the Silk Road, once celebrated as conduits of wealth and exotic goods, became unknowing carriers of terror. Caravans laden with silk and spices brought prosperity, but also carried in their shadows the seeds of catastrophe. Rats scurried among the baggage trains, and fleas fed unseen on their blood. No one suspected that such small, ordinary creatures bore the weight of death for millions. By the early 1340s, the disease had reached the bustling ports of the Black Sea. One story, now half legend and half history, tells of the siege of Kaffa in 1346, where the Mongol army, stricken with plague, is said to have catapulted infected corpses over the city walls in an early form of biological warfare. Whether this dramatic tale is entirely true or not, what matters is that ships fleeing from Kaffa carried the disease westward. The ports of the Mediterranean soon opened their gates not only to merchants but to death itself. Genoa, Venice, and Marseille became the earliest footholds of the pestilence in Europe. The transition from rumor to reality was swift. One moment, reports of distant sickness could be dismissed as stories from foreign lands. The next, sailors staggered ashore with fevers, their bodies covered in dark swellings, and within days, entire neighborhoods fell silent. In Genoa, citizens saw ships limping into the harbor, their decks littered with corpses. Those who dared approach quickly fell themselves. The invisible enemy had arrived, not with banners or fanfare, but with silence and rot. The people of the 14th century were not ignorant, but they lived in a world where explanations leaned heavily toward the mystical. They could not see bacteria, they could only witness its effects. When whole families perished within a week, the mind sought reasons. Some said the air itself was corrupted, poisoned by mist from swamps or by the foul breath of the stars. Others believed in poisoned wells, rumors spreading that enemies or outcasts had deliberately tainted the water. And still others whispered of divine punishment, a wrathful God unleashing suffering upon a sinful humanity. Each explanation, however flawed, gave the terror shape. Here, fact and legend entwined. Chronicles describe real outbreaks, noting the rapid pace at which towns emptied. Yet alongside them circulated tales that gave the plague a face. In rural France, people spoke of a dark-robed figure moving unseen through the night, brushing against doorways and leaving death behind. In Norway, whispers told of a pale woman, her cloak sweeping through villages, invisible to most but fatal to all she touched. Such stories spread as quickly as the sickness itself, each adding another layer of dread to an already unbearable reality. The plague advanced inland from the Mediterranean like a tide, unstoppable and unpredictable. In Marseille, reports tell of deaths so swift that bodies piled in streets, with burial grounds unable to hold them all. From there, the sickness climbed northward into France, Germany, and Spain, carried by merchants, travelers, and soldiers. Rats scuttle from wagons into barns. Fleas hop from host to host, and the invisible web tightened across Europe. No fortress, no monastery, no castle wall proved high enough to keep it out. The speed of the spread bewildered observers. In England, chroniclers noted that the plague arrived in 1348, likely brought by ships into the port of Dorset. Within weeks it reached London, the heart of the kingdom. People there, too, searched for explanations. Some saw it as a result of a recent earthquake that had shaken the earth, releasing foul vapors. Others pointed to the conjunction of planets, claiming the stars themselves had turned against humanity. The ordinary turned strange. Sudden storms, odd-colored sunsets, or swarms of insects were taken as omens of the pestilence's approach. It is worth pausing to reflect on this moment in history, the arrival of something vast and unseen. For those alive then, there was no certainty, no scientific clarity, only fear wrapped in rumor. They saw friends collapse within hours, neighbors vanish overnight, whole parishes silenced. When the sickness seemed to appear without warning, explanation became inseparable from imagination. To survive even a single day was to navigate a world that no longer felt solid, where the air, the water, the heavens, and even strangers on the street might conceal death. Yet within this terror lay the seeds of legend. The very invisibility of the plague gave birth to stories. People described the disease as if it had intention, as if it sought out victims with malice. Some said they saw shadows move against the wall, though no person stood there. Others swore that animals, too, sensed the coming plague, with dogs howling endlessly and birds abandoning towns just before sickness arrived. The more inexplicable the disease became, the more richly the stories grew. This blending of history and myth was not accidental, it was necessary. The human mind craves cause and effect, even when none is visible. In a time without microscopes, what could be more believable than the idea of death walking in the form of a hooded figure, or drifting invisibly like a poisonous fog? These explanations, terrifying though they were, provided a kind of order to chaos. They offered people something to grasp when the truth was too small to see. From the bustling ports of the Mediterranean to the quiet hamlets of northern Europe, the arrival of the plague left a trail of fear. It began with ships, then with towns, and soon with entire countries. Each new place it touched added its own interpretation, its own local legend, until the plague became not one story but many, woven together in a tapestry of dread. And so the invisible enemy, faceless yet everywhere, became both a reality and a myth, shaping the way history would remember those years forever. As the pestilence spread, life itself began to unravel. Streets grew quieter, markets emptied, and the world seemed to tilt into shadow. Yet the arrival was only the beginning. What followed was not just death, but transformation of faith, of art, of society, and of the very imagination of Europe. The plague had stepped ashore, and with it came a tide of panic, ritual, and legend that would sweep through every corner of the continent. When the plague settled firmly within the towns and villages of Europe, the familiar rhythms of life began to fracture. What had once been ordinary, laughter in the markets, bells tolling for mass, children running along narrow lanes, shifted into a world where silence and fear took root. It is here that history becomes most vivid, because the daily lives of ordinary people were transformed almost overnight. The Black Death was not an event that passed in distant halls of power. It entered kitchens, it crept into bedrooms, and it clung to the very air of every street. At first, there was confusion. Illness was not a stranger to medieval Europe. Fevers, small outbreaks, and local sicknesses were a part of life. But the plague was different. Families who fell ill in the morning could be dead before nightfall. People collapsed in markets or while walking home from church. Bodies were discovered slumped over wells, or motionless in fields where they had gone to work only hours before. The speed left little time for understanding. Panic grew, not steadily but explosively, as neighbors watched the familiar faces of their community vanish one after another. Markets, once alive with chatter, began to empty. Merchants avoided travel, fearful of bringing sickness back with them. Goods went unsold, coins unspent, and stalls once piled with grain or cloth stood abandoned. In many towns, even the church bells, symbols of both ritual and reassurance, fell silent because the very priests who rang them had succumbed. The centerpieces of medieval life, commerce, and faith seemed to fade in unison. With fear came suspicion. When people cannot understand why disaster falls, they search for signs, for patterns, for culprits. In some towns, travelers were turned away at the gates. Foreigners were eyed with distrust, their unfamiliar speech or clothing enough to mark them as carriers of disease. Families closed their doors tightly, sometimes nailing them shut from the inside, as though wooden planks could keep out the invisible breath of death. In some cases, entire households chose isolation so strict that weeks later, neighbors would find only silence behind the barred doors. The ordinary rituals of mourning became impossible. There were too many dead and too few hands to bury them. Graveyards overflowed, and trenches were dug to receive bodies in numbers the earth had never before been asked to hold. Funerals, once solemn occasions of prayer and gathering, were horrid or abandoned entirely. The sight of carts piled high with the dead rolling through narrow streets became so common that people ceased to react with shock. Children who survived grew accustomed to images that no child should ever have known. In such an atmosphere, it was only natural for the human imagination to supply its own visions. And visions there were. Chroniclers record strange occurrences that people whispered about in hushed voices. Some claimed to have seen ghostly processions moving through the streets at night, pale forms carrying candles, their faces hidden, vanishing when approached. Others swore that animals acted strangely. Dogs howled at empty spaces. Cats arched their backs and hissed at corners where no person stood. Horses refused to pass down certain lanes as though sensing something unseen. To those who lived through it, the world itself seemed haunted. Superstitions grew daily. A flock of crows circling over a field, a sudden chill wind, or even the color of the clouds at sunset could be interpreted as signs that the plague was near. Mothers warned their children not to whistle at night, for fear it might draw the attention of wandering spirits. In the countryside, people told stories of spectral hounds moving silently between villages, their glowing eyes marking the places where death would strike next. Fear also turned inward. Families often abandoned their own sick, believing that the only way to survive was to sever all ties. Parents left children, husbands left wives, and friends turned from one another, each hoping to escape the contagion. Yet in other households, the opposite was true. Family members clung desperately together, refusing to let go even as one after another fell ill. Both responses, abandonment and devotion, left deep marks on the memory of those who survived. In some cities, the panic gave rise to ritual processions. Citizens marched barefoot through the streets, praying aloud, holding candles, or chanting psalms. These processions, meant as acts of devotion, often became scenes of terror themselves, as participants collapsed mid-prayer, their voices falling into silence. Yet the hope that such rituals might appease divine anger was powerful, and they persisted even in the face of repeated disappointment. The transformation of daily life was not only about loss, but also about strangeness. Things that once felt certain became fragile. Neighbors no longer greeted each other with warmth, but with suspicion, sometimes crossing to the other side of the street to avoid a glance or cough. Shops closed, schools fell silent, and towns once full of sound became landscapes of eerie stillness. The familiar was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of waiting, as if every street held its breath for the next death. In this atmosphere, folklore flourished. To explain the strange quiet of the towns, people spoke of ghostly bells ringing in the night, or the sound of invisible footsteps pacing outside homes. In some villages, survivors told of seeing pale figures leaning against church walls or moving slowly through cemeteries, figures that vanished when approached. Whether these were hallucinations born of exhaustion and grief or the fertile soil of imagination, they became part of the stories passed down for generations. The panic in the streets was not uniform. In some places, townspeople fled to the countryside, believing that open air would spare them. Yet even there, the sickness followed. In others, villagers barricaded themselves in, refusing entry to outsiders. But the plague respected no boundary. Whether in a bustling city square or a lonely farmstead, its arrival was inevitable. And everywhere it went, the response was the same: confusion, fear, suspicion, and stories. This section of the plague's history shows us how ordinary life dissolved into strangeness. A world once measured by the steady pace of bells, markets, and prayers slipped into silence, suspicion, and whispers of the supernatural. The Black Death did not only claim bodies, it transformed perception, turning every shadow, every sound, every empty street into a canvas upon which fear could paint its darkest visions. From these streets filled with both panic and legend, a new form of devotion began to rise. Some believed the only hope of survival lay in acts of extreme repentance, in public displays of suffering meant to appease an angry God. It is to these processions of the flagellants, grim and haunting, that we now turn. Out of the silence of emptied towns and the fear that hung like a fog over Europe, a new spectacle emerged. It was not the quiet retreat of monks into prayer or the hushed sobs of families mourning their dead. It was something louder, more dramatic, and to many more terrifying than the plague itself. From the dust of the roads came processions of men, barefoot and ragged, their bodies half covered in rough cloth, their eyes wild with conviction. These were the flagellants, pilgrims of pain who believed that only through their own suffering could humanity be cleansed of plague. They appeared first in the German lands, around 1348, though the roots of their rituals stretched further back into times of crisis. When disaster struck and explanations failed, some turned inward to prayer, while others turned outward to spectacle. The flagellants walked the roads in groups of dozens or even hundreds, moving from town to town in solemn, dreadful procession. Their arrival was marked not by trumpets, but by the sound of chanting voices and the crack of whips striking flesh. Each day they performed their grim liturgy. In the squares of towns already weakened by plague, they would gather, forming a circle. Stripping to the waist, they took up leather whips tipped with iron or knotted with bone. To the beat of chants and hymns, they struck their own backs, again and again, until blood flowed and the stones beneath their feet grew red. They cried out prayers of repentance, begging God to look upon their suffering and forgive the sins of the world. To them, the plague was not merely a sickness of the body, but a punishment for the corruption of humanity. Only extreme sacrifice, only visible and bloody atonement, could hope to lift the punishment from the earth. For those who watched, the effect was overwhelming. Townspeople crowded around, torn between awe and fear. Some fell to their knees in tears, convinced that the spectacle was holy, that these men had found the path to salvation. Others recoiled, whispering that such madness could only deepen the wrath of heaven. Children sometimes cried out in terror at the sight of men drenched in their own blood, moving with rhythmic chants as though possessed by some spirit. The flagellants inspired both devotion and dread, becoming part of the very folklore of the plague. Their processions did not pass quietly. They sang songs of repentance, carried banners marked with a cross, and often refused food or shelter, living only on what towns offered them in pity or fear. They moved like shadows across Europe, uninvited yet impossible to ignore. Behind them, they left trails of stories, tales of miracles performed, of sudden recoveries attributed to their presence, or of curses upon towns that rejected them. Some chronicles recorded that entire villages believed themselves saved after flagellant procession, while others noted that the plague often returned regardless, mocking the spectacle of human suffering. The church itself grew uneasy. At first, some clergy welcomed the movement, seeing it as an expression of piety in dark times. But as the flagellants grew in number and influence, they began to preach messages that strayed from official doctrine. They condemned priests, accused the papacy of corruption, and declared themselves instruments of divine judgment. Their sermons were raw, fueled by the urgency of the plague, and they drew crowds away from established churches. What had begun as an act of penance risked becoming a challenge to authority. By 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a condemnation of the flagellants, ordering their processions to be disbanded. Yet in many places, their memory lingered long after their whips had fallen silent. The legends surrounding the flagellants were as striking as the processions themselves. Some said they carried with them relics of great power, hidden in their banners, that could ward off death. Others believed that angels walked unseen among their ranks, guiding their chants and adding unseen blows to their backs. There were darker stories, too, whispers of their rituals stirred demons, or that the blood they shed drew spirits from the earth. For common folk, the sight of men punishing themselves to the edge of death blurred the line between holy devotion and fearful sorcery. In the eyes of many, the flagellants embodied both extremes of the human response to the plague, desperation and hope. Their marches were a performance of suffering meant to restore balance in a broken world. Yet to some, their presence only deepened the strangeness of daily life, as though the plague had not only stolen lives but also unmoored reason itself. What could be more unsettling than a group of men who welcomed pain, who sought it out as the only cure for the sickness that surrounded them? The stories of their miracles, true or imagined, traveled quickly. One village might swear that the flagellants brought temporary relief, only for the next to claim that their arrival invited worse misfortune. To peasants living in fear, the sight of the processions was often interpreted as a sign that the end of days had truly come. For others, it offered at least a comfort of action, a belief that someone, somewhere, was doing something to plead with God on behalf of all. As the months and years passed, the movement began to dwindle, especially as church opposition grew firmer. But the memory of the flagellants endured, woven into the fabric of plague folklore. In paintings and manuscripts, they appear as gaunt figures, whips raised in the air, their backs striped with wounds. In folk songs, they are remembered as wandering shadows, passing through towns and vanishing into the night, leaving only blood and prayers behind. The flagellants remind us that in times of unimaginable fear, humanity often seeks extremes. Where priest sermons were not enough, where medicine had no cure, the body itself became the canvas of desperation. Theirs was a faith written in blood, a belief that if enough suffering was offered, perhaps the heavens would relent. It was a belief both beautiful in its devotion and terrifying in its spectacle. Their processions form a bridge between history and legend, because what they did was real, yet what people saw in them often stretched into myth. Some saw saints, others saw madmen, and still others saw heralds of doom. In the quiet that followed their departure, townspeople spoke of them in whispers, as though they were beings both human and otherworldly, shaped by the darkness of the times. From the flagellants we move into the world of dark imagination still. If men could transform themselves into instruments of suffering, then what of the plague itself? Was it not possible that the disease was more than an illness, that it was a living presence, a demon cloaked in shadow, moving unseen through the streets? It is to these personifications, these legends of the plague as a figure of death and malice, that we next turn. As the plague raged on, killing without reason and striking down both sinner and saint, rich and poor alike, people began to imagine it not as a simple illness, but as something alive, a creature of shadow with its own hunger. To many, the plague was too deliberate, too cruel, to be explained by nature alone. It seemed to move with intention, sparing one street while annihilating another, creeping into locked homes, striking down the healthy in their sleep. And so the Black Death was reimagined in the collective mind not as a sickness, but as a demon, a dark spirit that walked unseen among the living. In whispered tales, the plague was described as a hooded figure, faceless and silent, moving through villages at night. Where it passed, dogs would howl and chickens would fall silent. Some claimed to see it standing at the edges of fields, a black shadow rising against the horizon. Others swore that it entered through windows in the form of smoke, wrapping itself around the sleeper before stealing the breath from their lungs. To the terrified, such visions made more sense than invisible particles or corrupted air. The plague had will, and its will was death. Legends grew of the demon's chosen form. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was said to be a crone with long, skeletal fingers, dragging a rake behind her. Each time she lifted the rake, a soul was taken, and each time she pressed it to the ground, entire households were marked for death. In Italy, stories told of a black-cloaked man who carried a scythe, reaping lives as a farmer reaps wheat. In German towns, the plague was imagined as a tall woman dressed in red, her face hidden, who walked silently into villages. Wherever she entered, the disease would follow. Such images gave shape to fear, making the invisible enemy something people could picture, even if they could not fight it. There were even stories of those who tried to confront the demon. Folklore speaks of priests and wise women who attempted rituals to drive it away, lighting great fires at crossroads or painting protective symbols on their doors. Some burned herbs and believed the smoke would repel the spirit. Others rang church bells through the night, hoping the sound would banish it. But always the plague returned, slipping through barriers, mocking the fragile defenses of humanity. In these tales, the demon was cunning, changing form, always staying one step ahead of those who sought to resist it. What made the demon of the plague so terrifying was not just its power but its indifference. Unlike devils of older legends, it did not bargain, it did not speak, it did not demand worship. It simply came and killed, leaving behind silence and empty streets. This made it feel more alien, more unstoppable, a force that could not be reasoned with. Some storytellers suggested that the plague demon fed on grief itself, growing stronger with every funeral, every weeping child, every despairing prayer. In this way, it was not only a killer but a parasite of sorrow, thriving on the despair it created. In the haunted imagination of the time, the demon did not always act alone. Some said it traveled with servants, ghostly dogs with burning eyes, or rats with human faces, scuttling through the alleys at night. Others spoke of shadows that lingered long after the sun rose, marks that showed where the plague had rested. In one chilling tale from France, villagers claimed to see a woman in black washing clothes in the river. The garments dripped with blood, and the water itself turned red as she worked. Those who saw her knew that the town was marked, and within days, the plague swept through. The fear of this demon shaped behavior in countless ways. Some refused to open their doors at night, convinced that the spirit prowled the streets after sundown. Others painted crude crosses on their walls, hoping to confuse or repel it. There were even villages that carried out strange nightly rituals, ringing bells, beating pots, or parading torches, acts of defiance against the unseen killer. Yet these acts, though born of desperation, only reinforced a sense that the plague was more than disease. One does not ring bells against an illness, one rings them against a presence. These stories reveal something profound about the human need for explanation in the face of chaos. An invisible disease could not be seen or understood, but a demon could. A demon could be feared, prayed against, or cursed. It could be blamed. The invention of the plague as a spirit gave people someone, or something, on which to focus their anger. To curse the demon was easier than to curse the air. To picture it as a cloaked figure at the door was more bearable than imagining it as formless, everywhere at once. The personification of the plague also found its way into art. Manuscripts from the later 14th century depict skeletal figures riding black horses, carrying banners of death across the countryside. In some illustrations, the plague appears as a monstrous creature looming over cities, its jaws wide open, swallowing whole crowds. These images did more than frighten. They made sense of tragedy by framing it within a cosmic drama, where humanity was not simply the victim of chance, but the target of a terrible, purposeful enemy. And yet, not all demon stories ended in despair. A handful of legends spoke of victories, however temporary. In one German tale, a priest confronted the plague spirit in a church, refusing to leave until it withdrew. He prayed through the night as the air grew heavy, and by dawn, the demon was gone, though whether banished or simply moved elsewhere, none could say. In another story from Hungary, villagers claimed that a group of children began to sing hymns so pure that the plague demon retreated from their town, unwilling to endure the sound of innocent voices. These hopeful tales, though rare, offered small islands of light amid the darkness. Over time, as the plague receded, the demon of death became less a terror of the present and more a figure of folklore. Parents warned children not to wander at night, lest a plague woman find them. Farmers claimed that strange withered patches of crops were marks where the demon had walked. Travelers told stories of meeting a shadow at a crossroads, who offered them a choice, to go left and find survival, or right and find ruin. Whether these tales were believed or not, they lingered, woven into the cultural memory of the Black Death. The demon of the plague teaches us something vital about human imagination. When faced with an enemy that cannot be seen, we give it a face. When suffering seems random, we give it a will. In doing so, we make sense of what otherwise feels unbearable. The plague as a demon was both comfort and curse. It gave people something to fight in their minds, but it also made their terror more vivid, more personal. Instead of an illness, they face a predator, and no locked door could keep it out. From these demon tales, the imagination would take an even darker turn. If the plague could walk like a spirit, then perhaps it could be spread by human hands, not by chance, but by malice. Rumors would grow of plots, of poisonings, of enemies working with a plague demon to destroy communities from within. Out of this fear came suspicion, scapegoats, and persecution, which formed the next chapter of this haunted history. As the plague tightened its grip across Europe, fear began to seek a human face. Disease itself was terrifying enough, but the unknown was worse. People yearned for explanations, for someone to hold accountable, for someone to punish. If the plague was not simply a demon walking the land, then surely someone had summoned it, spread it, or aided its dreadful work. Out of this desperation grew one of the darkest aspects of the Black Death, the persecution of scapegoats. In towns where the death toll rose by the day, whispers quickly turned into accusations. Many believed that the plague was not natural at all but caused by deliberate malice. Some said that wells had been poisoned, that bread had been tainted, or that powders had been scattered across doorsteps. Strangers were eyed with suspicion, and outsiders became targets. Fear blurred reason, and in the thick fog of grief, people searched for visible enemies to strike against. The Jewish communities of medieval Europe became the most tragic victims of this frenzy. Already living under centuries of prejudice, they were isolated, distrusted, and often confined to separate quarters within cities. As the plague advanced, their relative separation made them convenient scapegoats. Rumors spread rapidly that Jews had poisoned wells, that they had conspired to destroy Christendom, that they worked in secret pacts with demons. In many towns, tortured confessions were extracted from Jewish prisoners, their words twisted into proof of impossible crimes. The result was massacre. In Strasbourg, in the year 1349, the Jewish population was forced into the city square. Hundreds were burned alive, their screams rising into the winter sky as townsfolk watched. Elsewhere, Jews were expelled, imprisoned, or slaughtered outright. In Mainz and Cologne, whole communities were annihilated. These violent acts did nothing to slow the plague, but they gave desperate people the illusion of control. By killing the accused, they believed they might cleanse their cities of the evil that haunted them. But Jews were not the only scapegoats. In some regions, beggars and lepers were targeted. Lepers, already feared for their own disease, were accused of spreading the plague deliberately. Outsiders, travelers, and even poor women were singled out, accused of sorcery or working hand in hand with the plague spirit. To many, it seemed easier to imagine a conspiracy than to accept that death struck blindly and without cause. Conspiracy, at least, offered a sense of narrative, a villain to blame, a crime to punish. Some communities even accused foreigners passing through their lands. In a world where the plague traveled along trade routes, it was easy to believe that those arriving from elsewhere carried it on purpose. Merchants, sailors, and strangers were sometimes driven out violently, their goods seized, their lives ended. The suspicion of the foreigner was both a reflection of fear and a grim reminder of how quickly human beings can turn against one another in times of crisis. The persecution of scapegoats left scars deeper than the plague itself. The disease eventually ebbed, but memories of betrayal lingered. For Jewish communities, the massacres of the Black Death became part of a long chain of suffering, a link between earlier persecutions and the tragedies that would follow centuries later. For those who lived in villages where neighbors turned on neighbors, trust was broken. Even after the plague was gone, the question remained, how could they live beside those who had once been so ready to accuse? Yet there's another layer to this story, one of contrast. While some communities erupted in violence, others resisted the temptation to scapegoat. In a few towns, leaders protected their Jewish populations, reminding the fearful that the plague had struck both Jew and Christian alike. In some cities, the authorities punished those who spread false accusations. These moments of mercy, though rare, show that the human response to fear was not uniform. For every massacre, there were also acts of courage, small lights flickering against the darkness. The legends of scapegoats also merged with the supernatural. In certain regions, tales grew of witches brewing potions to summon the plague. Women who gathered herbs were accused of mixing poisons. Some storytellers even claimed that secret cults met in forests to call the plague demon, offering human sacrifices to feed it hunger. Though such stories were rooted in paranoia, they reveal the depth of the fear. The plague was not just illness, but a war waged by enemies both seen and unseen. This search for scapegoats reflected something deeply human. In times of chaos, people cling to explanations, even if they are cruel or irrational. To blame someone is to regain a sliver of control, to imagine that the suffering has a cause and therefore could have an end. It is easier to point to poisoned wells than to accept that death comes without reason. The tragedy is that this need for certainty often led to more suffering, compounding the devastation of the plague with the horrors of violence and betrayal. The persecution also reveals a contrast between what people believed and what we now know. Modern science tells us that the plague spread through fleas, rats, and human contact. But for medieval people, such knowledge was unimaginable. Their world was shaped by faith, suspicion, and rumor. In that world, scapegoats were not just victims. They were symbols embodying the unseen fears of their neighbors. By punishing them, communities believed they were striking back against the plague itself. As the plague continued, however, even the bloodiest persecutions could not stop it. After massacres, the disease still raged, taking both accused and accused alike. This cruel reality forced people to face the truth. Scapegoats offered no safety. Death marched on, indifferent to violence, unshaken by human vengeance. And so, when accusations failed, many turned to other forms of explanation, seeking not enemies among men, but signs from heaven or visions of the divine. This turn from earthly scapegoats to heavenly judgment forms the next step in the story of the Black Death. If no human could be blamed, then perhaps the finger of blame pointed higher. Perhaps God himself had unleashed the plague as punishment, and the only cure was repentance. From this belief grew movements of penance, of prayer, and of strange rituals meant to purify the world. And so we move from scapegoats and persecution to the haunted roads of the flagellants, whose processions filled Europe with both awe and dread. As the plague rolled like a storm across Europe, some looked for scapegoats to punish, while others sought healing from within. But there were also those who believed that the only answer was penance, deep, unrelenting, painful penance. If the plague was God's punishment for human sin, then surely only the cleansing of those sins could ease his wrath. Out of this conviction rose the flagellants, strange and unsettling processions of men who wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in public, their bodies dripping with blood in a desperate offering to heaven. The flagellant movement was not born entirely from the Black Death. Its roots lay earlier, in religious traditions of self-mortification, where some believed that suffering could bring one closer to God. But the plague gave this belief a terrible urgency. As death swept across villages, leaving churches packed with corpses and graveyards overflowing, the sight of these processions seemed both horrifying and strangely hopeful. Here were men willing to suffer openly, to take the weight of sin onto their own bodies, to show God that humanity was still capable of repentance. The processions often arrived suddenly. Imagine a town already thick with fear, where the air smelled of sickness and the church bells tolled constantly. Into this atmosphere came a line of men, bare-chested, their faces grim, their backs already streaked with blood. They moved slowly, chanting hymns that echoed through narrow streets. At intervals, they would stop, form a circle, and begin the ritual. Whips tipped with iron spikes tore into their skin as they struck themselves again and again, until blood splattered the ground. Onlookers, both terrified and fascinated, believed they were witnessing an act that might turn away divine anger. The flagellants believed they were fighting for all of Christendom. Many declared that their ritual suffering was not just for their own sins, but for the sins of the world. Some processions grew to hundreds of men, traveling from town to town like moving spectacles of devotion and despair. They marched barefoot, rejecting comforts, refusing to bathe, refusing to sleep in beds. They carried banners marked with crosses and sang hymns that mingled sorrow with hope. For them, each lash of the whip was a prayer, each drop of blood a plea for mercy. To ordinary people, the arrival of the flagellants was a double-edged vision. Some wept openly, believing these men were saving them from the plague. Women brought their children to touch the blood of the flagellants, convinced it carried a holy power. In villages where the processions passed, many joined, abandoning their homes to follow the brotherhood on its endless journey. Yet others looked on with fear, disturbed by the frenzy, the intensity, and the violence of the ritual. For some clergy, the flagellants were dangerous, bordering on heretical, for they bypassed the authority of the church and claimed to act as direct agents of God's justice. Indeed, the flagellants soon drew suspicion from the higher powers of the church. Pope Clement VI, who himself lived through the plague in Avignon, grew wary of the uncontrolled processions. While priests prayed in churches and the papacy issued indulgences, here were laymen, untrained and sanctioned, claiming to carry the cure for sin upon their backs. In 1349, the Pope condemned the flagellants, calling them misguided, even dangerous. Yet by then, their processions had already carved themselves into the memory of Europe. Legend surrounded the flagellants as much as facts. Some stories claimed that their blood-soaked rituals worked, that towns they visited saw a temporary decline in plague deaths. Others said the opposite, that their processions brought the plague with them, carrying disease on their unwashed bodies as they moved from place to place. In folklore, they became figures of mystery, half saints, half madmen, wandering across the land like living sacrifices. To some, they were holy warriors. To others, they were omens of doom. Their rituals were not only acts of repentance, but also performances, carefully structured to draw awe. Chronicles described them lying face down in the mud, chanting as whips cracked across their backs, or kneeling in silence before crucifixes while tears mixed with blood. They carried letters, sometimes forged, claiming divine sanction, said to have descended directly from heaven. These documents declared that the world was corrupt, that the plague was divine punishment, and that only the whips of the flagellants could wash away the stain. Whether genuine or false, such claims gave the processions a sense of authority that ordinary peasants dared not challenge. The emotional power of the flagellants lay in contrast. They were both terrifying and magnetic. Their suffering was horrifying to witness, yet it also stirred admiration. They embodied the desperation of the time, when ordinary prayer and ordinary remedies had failed. If the Black Death was a punishment beyond comprehension, perhaps only an equally incomprehensible response could match it. When the flagellants had passed, leaving behind echoes of chants and blood upon the stones, ordinary people still searched to heaven for answers. If the plague could not be explained by physicians, and if even prayer seemed powerless, then surely the signs of the sky might reveal the truth. The medieval world was steeped in a belief that the heavens and the earth were bound together, that the movements of the stars and planets echoed in the fates of men. To those who lived through the Black Death, the skies above became a vast, mysterious book, one that might hold a reason for the suffering below. Chroniclers recorded strange events in the heavens during the years surrounding the plague. Comets, with their fiery tails, streaked across the night sky, stirring dread in every heart that watched them. In the medieval imagination, comets were never neutral. They were omens of disaster, heralds of war, famine, or pestilence. The sudden appearance of a bright streak of light across the firmament seemed to many a clear signal that the heavens themselves had declared judgment. In the year 1347, just as the plague began its march through Europe, reports of unusual celestial phenomena multiplied, convincing many that the skies were announcing the catastrophe to come. Astrologers, respected figures in medieval society, were called upon to explain these portents. They pored over charts, tracing the alignments of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and declared that conjunction of certain planets had corrupted the very air of the world. This idea, miasma, or poisoned atmosphere, merged easily with astrological interpretations. The stars had conspired to taint the air, they said, and the plague was the inevitable result. For ordinary people, such explanations were frightening but also strangely comforting. The disease had a cause, and that cause was written in the heavens. Legends grew of fiery rains falling from the sky, of red clouds that glowed at night, of thunderous noises without storms. In some towns, people claimed to see shapes in the clouds, vast skeletal figures looming above, or angels with swords dripping blood. These visions, whether real or imagined, spread quickly by word of mouth, becoming woven into the folklore of the plague years. If the earth was suffering, it was only a reflection of a cosmic drama unfolding in the heavens. One of the most haunting omens recorded was the so-called death mist. Some chroniclers described strange, foul-smelling vapors drifting across fields and villages, glowing faintly under the moonlight. These mists, it was said, came from celestial disturbances, perhaps from shooting stars that fell to earth, or from the breath of comets themselves. To breathe the mist was to invite death. People avoided valleys where fog gathered, convinced that the plague demon moved in those low, pale clouds. Whether these were natural mists mixed with the stench of decay or products of fevered imagination, they reinforced a belief that the very air had turned against humankind. The fascination with omens extended to animals as well. Birds were said to fall dead from the sky. Flocks changed their migration patterns in strange ways, as if driven by invisible forces. In some towns, people swore that wolves howled endlessly outside their walls, warning of death within. Cats and dogs, once household companions, were slaughtered in some regions, thought to carry the plague spirit with them. Each unusual event in nature was read as a sign, each deviation from normal life a message from the heavens or the unseen world. Yet, as always in these dark times, interpretations varied. Some saw the celestial omens as signs of divine wrath, proofs that God had turned his gaze away. Others saw them as warnings, urging repentance and prayer. A few even saw them as promises that after the storm of suffering, the skies would clear and the world would be reborn. The stars, mysterious and unreachable, offered a canvas upon which every hope and fear could be painted. Artists of the later medieval period captured these sky portents in manuscripts and murals. Margins of prayer books showed comets blazing, angels pointing to stars, or skeletons dancing beneath glowing moons. In some towns, sermons were delivered not only about sin but about the heavens, urging the faithful to watch the skies for signs of when the plague might end. This blending of astrology, faith, and folklore gave the people a way to situate their suffering within a grander cosmic story. The Black Death was not only about their own village or family, it was written in the movements of the universe itself. And yet, beneath the awe and terror, there was another truth. The search for omens was a search for meaning. When half a village could die in a month, when whole families vanished overnight, people longed to believe that such devastation was not random. To read the skies was to believe that the suffering had purpose, that it was part of a pattern, however dark. The plague might be cruel, but at least it was not meaningless. Some chroniclers tell of nights when entire communities gathered to watch the heavens. The plague was not only a shadow in the sky or a fear whispered in the streets. It was a terror that announced itself on the human body. The Black Death revealed its presence in ways that were both horrifying and unforgettable, and those who lived through it carried memories of the symptoms as if they had stared into the face of death itself. To speak of the plague was to describe what it did to the flesh, the sudden and brutal transformations that left no doubt that a person was marked. It began, often, with a fever so sudden and fierce that it seemed to burn through the veins. A man could rise in the morning feeling strong, only to collapse by evening in a sweat-soaked delirium. The heat came with a pounding headache, as though invisible hammers struck inside the skull. Along with it came chills, weakness, and a sense of dread so heavy that many believed the soul itself recognized what the body did not yet know, that death was near. Soon after, the swellings appeared. These were the buboes, the most infamous sign of the plague, from which the disease took its name. They rose suddenly in the groin, armpits, or neck, hard lumps that grew quickly and painfully, sometimes swelling to the size of an egg or even an apple. To see a neighbor clutching their side in pain and uncovering a dark, swollen mass beneath the skin was enough to send fear rippling through an entire household. The buboes throbbed, burned, and blackened, as though some monstrous poison had gathered inside the flesh. Many sufferers moaned endlessly, unable to find relief, for the pain was sharp and unrelenting. Alongside the swellings came blotches upon the skin, dark patches, red or purple at first, spreading into ominous black stains. These spots, called God's tokens by some, seemed to mark the body as chosen for death. They could appear on the chest, arms, face, or legs, sometimes spreading so quickly that a healthy-looking person in the morning bore death's mark by nightfall. These black patches gave the disease its most terrifying name among common folk, the Black Death. Bleeding followed, from the nose, mouth, or even under the skin. Blood seemed to leak from places it was never meant to, staining pillows and clothes, filling mouths with a taste of iron. In some cases, coughing turned to vomiting of blood, leaving crimson stains on the ground and terrifying all who witnessed it. The body seemed to turn against itself, breaking down its barriers, surrendering entirely to the invisible invader. The sickness did not stop with the body. The mind, too, was seized. Victims often fell into delirium, speaking nonsense, laughing at strange moments, or shrieking as if pursued by demons. Some wandered the streets naked, raving, until they collapsed. Others grew eerily calm, as though they had already stepped beyond the boundary of life. Families watched loved ones lose not only their strength but their reason, recognizing them no longer in the wild eyes and fevered words. This madness deepened the terror, for it seemed not only the flesh but the very soul was under attack. The speed was perhaps the cruelest element. Unlike other illnesses that lingered for weeks, the plague often struck with swiftness. In many cases, death came within 3 days. Some did not survive even a single night. To watch a friend dine with you at supper and to carry their body to the grave the next morning was a common story. The suddenness left no room for preparation, no chance for goodbyes. Life felt as fragile as a candle flame, easily extinguished by an unseen breath. Those who tried to treat the symptoms were helpless. Physicians lanced the buboes, draining foul-smelling pus, but this brought little relief and often hastened death. Some recommended herbs, baths, or vinegar compresses, yet the swellings returned, darker and more painful. Others burned aromatic woods or carried flowers to mask the stench of the sick, but the disease paid no heed. To touch a victim was to risk joining them in suffering, yet many families could not abandon their own. Mothers nursed children, husbands held wives, knowing the closeness might doom them. Compassion and contagion were bound together in a cruel knot. Descriptions of the plague's symptoms filled chronicles, sermons, and even poems of the time. Some wrote with horror, others with resignation, but all agreed that the sickness was unlike anything the world had known. To see the blackened swellings, to hear the cries of those in fever, to smell the corruption of flesh, was to know one was living through an event beyond ordinary human understanding. The symptoms were not only physical, they became symbols of divine judgment, of cosmic punishment, of the world itself unraveling. Children were not spared. The sight of small bodies covered in blotches, their frail limbs trembling with fever, broke hearts across villages and towns. Parents often fell beside their children, leaving households entirely extinguished. In monasteries, monks wrote of brothers coughing blood upon their prayer books. In cities, grave diggers described carts filled with bodies swollen and stained, stacked like wood. When the plague stalked the land, and no physician could cure it, no king could command it, and no walls could keep it out, people turned toward ritual. In an age when the line between the physical and the spiritual was blurred, rituals of protection became shields, not always against the disease itself, but against the terror it carried. To light a candle, to whisper a prayer, to wear a charm, was to carve out a small island of hope in a sea of despair. Some of these rituals were deeply religious. In countless villages, church bells rang daily, their echoes believed to drive away the plague. Bells had long been seen as weapons against evil, their sound thought to scatter demons, and during the Black Death they tolled endlessly. Priests urged their flocks to confess sins, to fast, and to gather in processions that begged for divine mercy. Crosses were erected in the fields and at crossroads, places where the plague seemed to creep silently. The sight of neighbors kneeling in mud before a wooden cross became as common as the sound of weeping. In homes, families burned incense, filling their rooms with the smoke of rosemary, juniper, or frankincense. The scents were thought to cleanse the air, to chase away the corrupted vapors that many believed carried disease. Some carried pomanders, small, perforated bowls filled with herbs and spices, dangling them from their necks or belts like talismans. A whiff of lavender, a sprig of sage tucked into clothing, gave people the feeling that they were guarded by invisible walls of purity. In an unseen battle, even the faintest shield mattered. Others turned to charms and amulets, invoking old traditions that blended pagan echoes with Christian faith. Pieces of parchment inscribed with holy words were worn close to the skin. Medals stamped with saints' images, especially Saint Sebastian, protector against plague, and Saint Roch, who was said to heal sufferers, were treasured like treasures greater than gold. Parents tied protective charms to their children's wrists, hoping to ward off the touch of death. To hold such an object was to hold faith made solid. Astrology, too, shaped rituals of protection. Since many believed the plague was born from the misalignment of stars and planets, astrologers prescribed certain stones or metals as remedies. Some wore sapphires, others carried emeralds, said to balance the humors and shield against poisoned air. The heavens had caused a problem, it seemed, but perhaps the heavens could also offer protection. Amulets engraved with zodiac signs became small fragments of the cosmos held in one's hand. There were also darker, stranger rituals. In some places, people believed the plague demon could be tricked or driven away with noise and fire. Bonfires were lit in town squares, their flames reaching skyward, their smoke thick with burning herbs, fabrics, even animals. People sang loudly, beat drums, and fired cannons, hoping the chaos would frighten the spirit of pestilence. Others smeared tar upon doors, painted protective symbols above thresholds, or buried charms beneath thresholds to bar the plague from crossing into homes. At night, some placed bowls of water by their windows, believing the sickness would enter, drown in the water, and vanish with the dawn. In other regions, people carried knives or swords in ritual gestures, not to fight human enemies but to cut through invisible forces. The clash of steel against steel, ringing in narrow streets, was meant as a warning to the unseen foe. This house was defended, but not all rituals were public or communal. Many were private, intimate, and quiet. A mother might whisper the Lord's Prayer over her sleeping child, tracing the sign of the cross upon their brow again and again. A farmer might bury a consecrated wafer in his field, hoping the ground itself would be sanctified against the plague. Families hung images of saints in their homes, lighting candles before them until wax dripped like tears. These acts gave rhythm to days otherwise filled with fear, transforming dread into gestures of defiance. Legends also speak of stranger protections. Some believe that carrying the heart of a raven, dried and wrapped in cloth, could shield a person. Others thought that toads, placed upon buboes, would draw out the poison. Rings made from corals, or bones of saints, were worn as wards. While many of these practices may sound superstitious now, they reflect the human need to act, to resist passivity, to do something, anything, against the march of death. Even communities practice rituals of protection at larger scales. In Italy, whole towns would walk in processions, carrying relics of saints through their streets, chanting prayers, and sprinkling holy water at every door. In Spain, banners embroidered with holy images were raised high above city walls, as if to shield the town itself. In France, church services multiplied, each mass offered as a bulwark. The streets themselves became altars, with prayers echoing against stone and wood, as if the very air might be reshaped. The effectiveness of these rituals is not for us to judge with cold reason alone. For those who lived through the Black Death, such acts were not mere superstition. They were lifelines. To kneel in prayer was to feel less alone. To wear a charm was to feel protected by invisible allies. In a time when medicine failed and rulers were powerless, rituals gave people agency. They allowed families to believe they had a measure of control, however small, in a world that seemed utterly uncontrollable. But as the plague lingered, doubts grew. For all the candles burned, for all the charms worn, for all the prayers spoken, the dead still mounted. Some began to whisper that the rituals were not strong enough, or worse, that they angered God further. This despair led some away from protection and toward resignation, believing nothing could stop the tide. Yet even in resignation, rituals continued. If they could not stop the plague, they could at least ease the soul, offering comfort in the face of death. The legacy of these rituals outlived the plague itself. Many became traditions that endured, shaping how people responded to illness for centuries to come. The use of aromatic herbs, the wearing of saint medals, the ringing of bells, all survived into later times of crisis. They stand as echoes of a world where people fought fear with faith, uncertainty with gestures of hope. As the Black Death pressed on, however, rituals of protection gave way to deeper questions. If prayer and charm could not drive away the disease, then perhaps it was not a spirit that needed banishing, but a punishment that required understanding. The plague began to be seen less as an enemy to ward off and more as a divine scourge, sent to cleanse and to judge. And so, from rituals of protection, the story moves into visions of punishment and prophecy, where the plague was no longer merely a sickness but a message from heaven itself. As the plague tightened its grip and swept across the towns, cities, and countryside, many began to see it not simply as an illness but as a revelation, a message written by divine hand upon the world. The Black Death, to countless medieval minds, was punishment. It was judgment. It was prophecy fulfilled. Where physicians failed and rituals of protection faltered, imagination and faith turned upward, seeking meaning in the vast silence of the heavens. Priests stood in pulpits and told congregations that the plague was the price of sin. Human pride, greed, lust, and violence had offended God, and now his wrath walked the earth in visible form. To breathe corrupted air, to see the blackened buboes, to watch neighbors die without confession, was to glimpse God's anger unveiled. The plague became a sermon in itself, the body of the sicker living Scripture. If cities burned with fever, it was because their sins had kindled a fire. Prophecies sprang forth, some ancient, some newly written in trembling hands. Many turned to the words of Revelation, the final book of the Bible, and found eerie echoes. The horsemen of pestilence had ridden at last, it seemed, bringing balance to the scales of divine justice. The black blotches upon flesh became the seal of judgment, the carts of corpses a fulfillment of apocalyptic visions. In monasteries, monks copied texts with fresh urgency, convinced that the end of days had arrived. Others looked for signs in the skies. Strange comets, eclipses, and blood-red sunsets were taken as divine signals. Chronicles describe how people gathered in fields to watch unusual stars or fiery trails, whispering that heaven itself was warning them. Even weather became prophecy. Storms, hail, or sudden droughts were interpreted as heavenly commentary, each natural event woven into a tapestry of punishment. The world itself seemed to groan with messages for those willing to listen. Prophets and visionaries also rose from the suffering. Some were respected religious figures who spoke of dreams in which angels or saints revealed the cause of the plague. Others were ordinary men and women who, in fever or prayer, claimed visions of Christ or the Virgin Mary, pleading for repentance. A few warned that unless humanity turned from its sins, greater punishments would follow: famine, wars, and eternal damnation. Their voices spread quickly, for in a time when death was everywhere, even the faintest thread of divine insight could grip the imagination of thousands. But not all visions were of despair. Some saw in the plague an opportunity for purification. They preached that suffering was not merely destruction but also cleansing, that through the fire of death the world might be renewed, sins washed away, and souls prepared for heaven. To endure the plague faithfully, to accept it as God's will, was to be purified. In this way, the disease became both whip and balm, scourge and salvation. Prophecy also took darker, more political forms. In some cities, preachers declared that corrupt rulers, greedy merchants, or sinful priests had brought down the plague upon their people. The sickness, they claimed, was a mirror reflecting human corruption. Chronicles record fiery sermons in which priests accused whole nations of being under divine curse. Wars, they warned, were not only between men but between heaven and earth, and pestilence was God's chosen weapon. Among the common people, simpler prophecies circulated in rhyme and chant. Some said that when the crow perched upon the steeple, the plague would depart. Others believed that once a certain number of dead had been buried, the curse would lift. In taverns and markets, these sayings spread like fire, giving listeners comfort, even if only for a fleeting moment. To believe in prophecy was to believe in an end, a horizon beyond suffering. Yet with prophecy came fear of heresy. Not every vision was welcomed. Some who claimed divine dreams were silenced by church authorities, accused of speaking falsely in God's name. A few were executed for spreading panic or for suggesting that the plague signaled not God's punishment but his abandonment. Such voices challenged the fragile framework of meaning, and in an age desperate for order, they were often stamped out. Still, the hunger for visions was insatiable. In the darkest hours, people sought omens everywhere, in the flight of birds, the patterns of smoke, the shapes of clouds. A child's dream might be treated as prophecy, the mutterings of the fevered might be remembered as sacred warning. The world itself became a text to interpret, and every sign, no matter how small, carried the weight of eternal consequence. Looking back now, we can see how these visions of punishment and prophecy offer both burden and relief. They burdened by deepening fear, painting the plague as cosmic wrath. But they relieved by giving shape to the chaos, turning meaningless suffering into a story with reason and purpose. If death was punishment, then perhaps life could still be salvation. If the plague was prophecy, then perhaps the end was near, but so too was redemption. And so, communities clung to their visions, weaving them into songs, prayers, and chronicles. Even as the bodies mounted, they sought comfort in the belief that they were living through a sacred drama, one that reached far beyond the visible world. To them, the Black Death was not merely a sickness, it was a finger of God writing upon history. But visions could only sustain people for so long. After months and years of death, another need emerged, the need to mourn, to remember, and to rebuild. From prophecy, the story of the plague now bends toward remembrance, toward how survivors grappled with grief, and how they began to stitch together a world forever altered by what they had endured. When the wave of death finally began to ebb, Europe was left in a silence so heavy it seemed to press upon the land itself. The bells that had once tolled endlessly for the dying now rang more rarely, but their echoes hung in the air, a reminder how much had been lost. Mourning was not confined to single households or villages. It stretched across mountains and rivers, through kingdoms and empires. An entire continent grieved. The scale of loss was almost beyond comprehension. In some towns, half the population was gone. In others, two-thirds. Entire streets stood empty, their doors barred, their windows dark. Fields lay untended, vines unpruned, an orchard heavy with fruit no one came to harvest. Silence replaced the chatter of markets, and weeds grew through the cracks of abandoned courtyards. Where once there had been life and laughter, there were only echoes. Funerals had often been hurried during the height of the plague, bodies buried quickly to prevent contagion. But in the aftermath, survivors longed for the rituals of mourning they had been denied. Families returned to graves, building crosses, lighting candles, and saying prayers they had not been able to whisper when death first struck. Cemeteries became places of pilgrimage, where mothers, fathers, widows, and orphans gathered to weep together. The earth itself seemed a patchwork of sorrow, holding layer upon layer of the dead. Art became another language of mourning. Painters and sculptors, many of whom had seen their patrons and friends swept away, began to depict death with a new intensity. The image of the dance macabre, the dance of death, spread across Europe. Skeletons leading kings and peasants, merchants and clergy, all joined in the same grim procession. It was both a reminder and a lament, that death had spared no one, that the great leveling had been written into the heart of human life. These images were not only warnings, they were memorials, attempt to give shape to grief too vast a measure. Music, too, carried sorrow. Monks composed chants that echoed with despair and hope entwined. In churches, hymns rose like sighs, filling high stone vaults with the sound of mourning. Folk songs spoke of lovers lost, of villages emptied, of children gone too soon. For those who had no words of their own, these songs became vessels of feeling, giving voice to silent tears. Even centuries later, fragments of these laments survive, echoes of grief that once stretched from shore to shore. Communities also mourned through ritual fasting and days of remembrance. Kings proclaimed mourning periods, during which courts wore black and public celebrations ceased. Town councils declared annual processions to honor the dead. In some places, memorial chapels were built, adorned with skulls and bones, stark symbols that sorrow should not be forgotten. Entire generations grew up in the shadow of these reminders, raised in societies that carried mourning like an inheritance. But mourning was not only collective, it was deeply personal. A widow might keep her husband's cloak folded on her chest, untouched for years. A mother might visit the same patch of earth daily, whispering lullabies to the child she had buried there. Survivors often describe being haunted by dreams, seeing the faces of the dead in crowds, hearing their voices in the wind. The grief was constant, a silent companion that followed them through every season. There was also a darker side to mourning, guilt. Many who lived felt crushed beneath the weight of survival. Why had they been spared while others perished? Some believed they had been kept alive for a reason, and this belief drove them to acts of penance or service. Others carried the guilt like a wound, never healing, never finding peace. Chronicles tell of people who spend their remaining years in monasteries, withdrawing from the world as though unworthy of its joys. The plague's shadow reached even into children's games and rhymes. In later centuries, verses like Ring Around the Rosie were said to echo the memory of the Black Death, though scholars debate this. Whether true or not, the association itself reveals how deeply mourning entered cultural memory, seeping even into the play of future generations. Sorrow had written itself into the DNA of Europe, its pulse beating quietly beneath the surface of daily life. Yet, amid the grief, there was resilience. Mourning slowly gave way to rebuilding, and rebuilding required both memory and forgetting. Some communities clung to remembrance, marking anniversaries of their losses. Others chose to push sorrow aside, focusing instead on survival and growth. The balance between remembering and forgetting became a quiet struggle that shaped the centuries that followed. In monasteries and churches, mourning transformed into theology. The plague was remembered in sermons as both scourge and teacher, its grief a reminder of life fragility. In villages, stories of the dead became part of oral tradition, shaping local identity. A well, a field, or a house might be forever linked to those who had perished there. Mourning thus became a map, charting the geography of loss across the landscape. The mourning of a continent was also the mourning of time itself. People felt as though an age had ended, an entire chapter of history closed in sorrow. The old rhythms of life, the cycle of feast and festival, of planting and harvest, had been broken. To mourn was not only to grieve the dead, but to grieve the world that had been lost with them. When survivors looked upon their towns and fields, they saw not only emptiness, but the ghost of what had once been. The mourning that enveloped Europe did not last in stillness alone. Out of the ashes of grief, something began to stir. Quiet at first, almost invisible, like the faint green of shoots pushing through frost-hardened soil. The Black Death had destroyed so much, yet in its terrible destruction it also loosened the grip of old structures and opened spaces where new ways of life could emerge. These seeds of change were planted in sorrow, watered with tears, but they would grow into the foundations of a different world. The most immediate change was in the balance of power between those who worked the land and those who ruled it. For centuries, peasants had lived in the shadow of feudal lords, bound by obligations that left them little room to breathe. But when half the population vanished, the survivors found themselves suddenly more valuable. Fields still needed to be plowed, livestock tended, towns supplied. Landowners could no longer command obedience so easily. They needed workers, and workers could now demand better conditions. Wages rose in many places, and the idea that labor had dignity and worth began to spread like a new fire in the minds of the poor. This did not come without resistance. Many rulers and nobles tried to freeze wages, to bind peasants back to the soil as though nothing had changed. Laws were passed in England, France, and beyond to stop workers from demanding more. But such decrees were like walls built against a rising tide. They could not hold forever. Peasants protested, fled, or rebelled, their voices echoing with newfound courage. Though the road ahead was long and uneven, the seed of social transformation had been sown, and it would not wither. In cities, too, change blossomed. The merchant classes, many of whom had survived with their wealth intact, found new opportunities in a world where the old hierarchies were weakened. Trade routes had been disrupted, but necessity created innovation. Guilds reorganized, markets shifted, and the idea of personal enterprise grew stronger. The plague had reminded all of mortality, and with that reminder came a hunger for achievement, wealth, and recognition in the here and now. Slowly, a spirit of individualism emerged, one that would later fuel the Renaissance. Religion, shaken to its core by the plague, also became a ground where change took root. For many, faith had been tested. How could God allow such devastation? Some clung to the church with greater devotion, seeking comfort in its rituals. Others turned away, disillusioned by priests who had fled or by prayers that seemed unanswered. Alternative movements and mystical sects grew in strength, offering more personal paths to the divine. The authority of the church, though still immense, had been cracked, and through those cracks new light would eventually enter. Education and thought, too, began to shift. With so many clerics and scholars dead, universities and monasteries faced shortages. Yet this vacuum created opportunities for new voices to be heard. Survivors, especially in urban centers, began to value literacy and knowledge as tools not only for salvation but for advancement in a changing world. In Italy, where wealth and trade concentrated, families began to invest in learning, arts, and philosophy, nurturing the early stirrings of humanism. The seeds of intellectual rebirth lay dormant, waiting for the right season to burst into bloom. Even the relationship between humanity and the natural world was altered. With fields abandoned and villages empty, wildness reclaimed the land. Forests spread where plows had once cut deep furrows, and wolves were said to prowl closer to towns. To the survivors, this return of nature was both frightening and awe-inspiring. It reminded them of their smallness, their fragility, but it also invited a deeper contemplation of the rhythms of the earth. Farmers who returned to their fields worked them with a new respect, aware of how quickly life could be taken away. Philosophers and mystics found in nature a mirror of both mortality and renewal. Culturally, the plague left its mark in subtle yet lasting ways. Survivors carried a heightened awareness of death, but this awareness sharpened their appetite for life. Feasts, festivals, and celebrations, when they returned, were infused with a wild intensity, as though people were determined to taste every joy before it was stolen. Love, laughter, and beauty were sought not as luxuries but as necessities in a fragile world. This hunger for life itself, tempered by memory of death, became one of the defining features of post-plague Europe. Architecture, too, bore traces of change. While many grand projects had been abandoned mid-construction during the plague years, later generations resumed them with renewed vigor. Cathedrals, town halls, and bridges rose again, but often with subtle differences. Designs that embrace light more openly, spaces that welcome community more fully. Some scholars believe that the trauma of the Black Death pushed architects and patrons alike to create works that spoke not only of divine power but of human resilience, blending heaven's promise with earthly strength. The shadow of the Black Death did not vanish when the pestilence itself receded. Though the graves filled, the candles burned down, and the cries of mourning grew quieter, its echo lingered across the centuries like a faint tolling bell that never stopped ringing. Generations that followed lived with memories carved into their bones, told to them by survivors or written into chronicles. What had once been an immediate catastrophe slowly transformed into legend, cautionary tale, and cultural inheritance, shaping thought, behavior, and imagination long after the last wave of plague had passed. In many villages, the stories were passed through families, whispered at firesides when winter winds howled. Grandparents described how entire streets had been silenced overnight, or how carts of the dead rolled endlessly through the roads. These accounts became more than memories. They became myth, retold and reshaped with every generation. Children grew up knowing that life could collapse in a single season, that security was an illusion, and that vigilance against unseen forces was always required. The echo of fear settled into their subconscious, a reminder that fate was both cruel and unpredictable. Art and literature carried the echo as well. In illuminated manuscripts, in murals on church walls, and later in printed books, images of skeletal figures dancing hand in hand with kings, merchants, and peasants became common. This motif, known as a dance of death or dance macabre, spoke with stark clarity. No one could escape mortality. These figures were not simply reminders of decay. They were storytellers, pressing their cold fingers against the hearts of viewers and whispering that pride, wealth, or power offered no protection. Such imagery became timeless, reappearing in art across Europe for centuries, a haunting chorus repeating the lesson of the plague. Writers, too, were deeply marked. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, wove stories told by survivors who had fled Florence during the plague, their laughter and desire for pleasure framed by the backdrop of disaster. His tales echoed far beyond his own century, influencing European literature with their blend of mortality's shadow and life's vibrancy. Later poets and dramatists, such as William Shakespeare, lived in a world where plague outbreaks still returned again and again, and their works occasionally carried lines or references that betrayed this inherited fear. Plague was never just history. It was a ghostly presence woven into the fabric of art. Religion's echo was equally profound. The Church, though it endured, never fully regained the unquestioned authority it once held. The memory of priests who abandoned their flocks or prayers that failed to stop the pestilence continued to live in people's hearts. Faith did not vanish, but it evolved into something more complex, tinged with doubt and yearning for answers that went beyond traditional doctrine. The late medieval hunger for mysticism, for direct connection with the divine, and eventually the Reformation's challenge to Rome, can all be traced, at least in part, to the tremors the Black Death left behind. In politics and governance, the echoes sounded in subtle but lasting ways. The uprisings of peasants in the years after the plague, rebellions like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, did not succeed in dismantling hierarchy immediately, but they left scars and lessons. Rulers became wary of pushing populations too far, and the idea that the common people had voices and strength could never be entirely suppressed. Though centuries still stood between those early stirrings and modern democracy, the first murmurings of discontent echoed from a world changed by plague. Medicine and science also bore the resonance. The plague had humbled healers, exposing the limits of their knowledge. Yet that very failure planted a determination to understand disease more deeply. Over centuries, this determination fueled gradual advances, from anatomical studies to the first steps of epidemiology. The memory of the Black Death lingered in medical history as a warning of what ignorance could cost, and as a motivator to pierce the mysteries of contagion. Even when later plagues returned in new forms, physicians carried with them the grim lessons of the 14th century. In culture and folklore, the echoes took stranger shapes. Superstitions blossomed, some of which persisted far longer than the plague itself. The fear of foul air, miasma, remained embedded in European thought until the discovery of germs many centuries later. Amulets, charms, and protective rituals survived, relics of a time when desperation ruled and rational answers were few. In songs, proverbs, and sayings, fragments of plague memory persisted, subtle reminders of an era when death had been an ever-present companion. Cities, too, held the echo in their very bones. Narrow medieval streets that once funneled sickness became symbols of danger, and over time urban planning began to change. Wider roads, open squares, and eventually sanitation reforms all traced part of their lineage to memories of disease. The echo of the Black Death was not only in words and art, but in stone and wood, in the very layouts of the spaces where people lived. Every cobblestone city that grew into the modern age carried within it the memory of survival and fear. Economically, the resonance shaped trade and expansion. For those who lived after the Black Death, The fragility of life spurred risk-taking. Merchants looked outward, seeking new opportunities, new markets, and new routes. The eventual age of exploration, with its ships crossing unknown oceans, can be partly understood as an echo of plague trauma, a desire to rebuild, to seek fortunes beyond the haunted towns of Europe, to chase life even to the ends of the world. The darkness of the plague paradoxically opened pathways to expansion and discovery. In more personal ways, the echoes touched individuals long after the pestilence had gone. Marriage patterns shifted, with survivors marrying younger or choosing partners with greater urgency. Family structures adapted, with inheritances suddenly concentrated, reshaping the destinies of generations. Even the rhythm of festivals and holidays bore the mark of the plague. Traditions that emphasized community, remembrance, or seasonal renewal carried deeper weight for those whose ancestors had faced the silence of empty towns. The echo also lived on in language. Words and phrases rooted in plague experience endured for centuries. Terms for quarantine, pest houses, and contagion filtered into everyday speech. The very concept of plague became metaphorical, used to describe not only disease but corruption, war, or moral decay. In every age since, when people face new disasters, they reach back to the memory of the Black Death as the archetype of devastation. Its echo became a universal reference point, shaping how humanity spoke of suffering itself. What is most striking, perhaps, is how the echo of the Black Death still reaches us today. Modern pandemics awaken memories of that ancient catastrophe, and we find ourselves drawing comparisons, seeing shadows of the past in our own struggles. The lessons of fragility, of resilience, of society reshaped by mortality, they remain alive centuries after the plague cart stopped rolling. The Black Death is not only history, it is a presence that speaks across time, whispering caution and wisdom to every new generation that encounters crisis. As the long story of the Black Death draws to a close, one cannot help but feel the weight of its shadow stretching across time. The plague was not only a calamity of its own century, it was a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting the fragility of life, the unpredictability of fate, and the resilience that rises even in the face of overwhelming darkness. In its wake, it left behind both scars and seeds, despair and rebirth, haunting reminders and hopeful beginnings. The memory of that era continues to whisper to us, asking what we have learned and how we choose to carry those lessons forward. The first lesson is one of humility. No empire, no crown, no church, and no common home was untouched by the plague. In palaces and in cottages, in monasteries and in marketplaces, the same enemy reigned. The plague stripped away illusions of invulnerability, revealing the truth that all stand equal before mortality. This lesson, though harsh, was also clarifying. It reminded humankind of the need for compassion, for kindness across class and creed, because in the end, the same earth waits to embrace us all. The second lesson is resilience. Though the Black Death shattered lives and emptied towns, it did not silence the human spirit. Survivors rebuilt their homes, tilled their fields anew, and raised songs in churches once more. They loved, married, and dreamed again, even while carrying sorrow in their hearts. The world they made was not the same as the one that had been lost, yet it bore the marks of endurance. From that endurance grew art, ideas, and freedoms that reshaped the centuries ahead. In the deepest night, humanity found ways to kindle light. Another lesson lies in curiosity and knowledge. The plague revealed the limitations of old understandings, and it pushed people, slowly but surely, toward new ways of questioning. Medicine, science, and philosophy began to stretch beyond ancient boundaries, fueled by a desire to grasp the mysteries of disease and the workings of the world. Though answers did not come quickly, the seeds planted in that soil of loss eventually blossomed into discoveries that changed the trajectory of history. Tragedy, in its paradoxical way, became a teacher. The echoes of the Black Death also teach us about memory. The survivors of that age passed down their stories, woven into art, literature, and legend. They reminded future generations not to forget, not to take life for granted, not to assume safety as a permanent gift. These echoes still surround us as we recall the plague during times of new crises. Each retelling is not only a remembrance of death, but also a quiet affirmation of life, that even in the darkest chapters, humanity continues to write the next page. There is, too, a lesson of balance between shadow and light. The Black Death was devastation, but it also cleared paths for transformation. It destroyed old orders but opened space for new voices. It scarred art with images of death but inspired art that celebrated life. It was both an ending and a beginning. To listen to its story is to understand that history itself is rarely simple. It is woven of contrasts, of despair that gives rise to hope, of endings that lead into renewal. And finally, the plague reminds us of the mystery at the heart of existence. Even today, with science advanced and knowledge vast, the question of why such catastrophes strike still lingers. The Black Death does not yield simple answers. Instead, it humbles us with a reminder that much lies beyond human control. Yet within that mystery lies an invitation to cherish the fragile beauty of the present, to hold close the bonds of love and community, and to walk forward with both caution and courage. As the echoes fade into the night, what remains is not only a record of suffering but a testament to survival. The world that emerged from the Black Death was haunted, yes, but it was also alive, vibrant, and yearning. That yearning carried humanity into new ages of thought, art, and discovery. It carried our ancestors forward, and it carries us still. The Black Death belongs to history, but its lessons belong to every age. They are not meant to frighten us into despair, but to awaken us to gratitude, resilience, and awareness of our shared humanity. In listening to its story, calmly and quietly, we glimpse both the shadows and the light that live within us all. And as we close this chapter, we do so with the understanding that history's darkest nights can also guide us toward the dawn.